Today's entire lecture is about Mozart. Be sure to read pages 215 to 217 and also 229 to 235. I will upload the student report on Mozart, but I will also include a few tidbits about Mozart in the following PowerPoint.
Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born in 1756 and died in 1791. So you'll see he was very young when he died, only 35 years old. And so he has a very interesting life, and we will have a student report on Mozart, and we'll probably have a lot of good information on him because he's just a fascinating composer. As in the past, I will go ahead and give some tidbits on Mozart because the student report might not cover some of the things I think are really interesting. But first of all, thing that is important to know about Mozart is that he was a child prodigy, which means this is a child who has abilities of people who've been performing for years and years and years, but yet they can play very well like someone who's studied for a long time when they're only 5, 6, 7 years old. And so his father took him all over Europe performing for royalty. And in fact, his father took his sister with him as well. She was also quite the performer, but she didn't become as famous as Wolfgang. And the father was hoping that they would be paid good money for this, but generally the royalty would just give them little trinkets and little watches and music boxes, and so it was not as financially fantastic for the family as he had hoped. But Mozart could play blindfolded or behind his back, and was just this adorable little child who could play fantastically with all sorts of restrictions put on him. He could still play, and so he was just an amazing child. One of the interesting things about Mozart is he had a musical photographic memory, so he could hear a composition, then go and write down everything that he heard. So he could go and hear pieces that other composers had written, and he just pretty much could write down everything that he heard. And some pieces were not supposed to even be available to the public, but he could go home and write down. Once he'd heard the concert, he could write it down. He also, like if another composer had written a piece, the employer would say, well, let's see what Mozart could do with that. So the composer would sit down and play his piece, and then Mozart would just write all kinds of fantastic improvisation and just new music above it and improve upon it. And so the other composers sometimes were not real fond of Mozart. So this goes along also with the fact that he never rewrote any of his compositions. They were entirely complete in his head before he put pen to paper. So he could be playing a game of pool while writing down his piece. So in other words, the whole piece, every single note that every instrument was going to play was in his head. So he could be playing a game of a pool, a game of cards, and have his score in front of him. And whenever it wasn't his turn, he'd just be writing out the notes because it was already all in his head. Most composers erase and rewrite and think about it and can't make up their mind, and they just go over and over it multiple times, but not Mozart. He had the whole thing set up in his head. Third interesting thing about Mozart is because he was such a genius, he did not get along with many or maybe even most of his employers, and he liked to spend money and party. So actually some of his employers physically kicked him out of the door because he was being so rude and obstinate and not going with obeying what the employer wanted him to do. Now, thankfully, during the classical era, we talked about how that there was an emancipation of the composer. So Mozart was able to make some money in opera houses and by teaching lessons and by selling some of his music, but he had a hard time keeping steady employment. This tied to the fact that he liked to party and he liked to spend money meant that he was poor and destitute when he passed away at the age of 35. And some believe he died of liver disease caused by drinking so much. And so as a result, the family did not even have money to purchase a burial plot for him or a tombstone. Who would have thought he was going to die at age 35? Anyway, that's fairly young, even in the classical era. And so there was no money for a burial, and he was just taken out into a mass grave of everyone who had died that day, and everyone was just buried together that had died that day, and it was an unmarked mass grave. So no one knows where Mozart is buried. Interestingly, I've been to Austria and I've seen the gravestone of his father, Leopold Mozart, and next to Leopold is Mozart's wife. And interestingly, on her tombstone it says that she was the first wife of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. First she was the wife of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and then actually after Mozart passed away, she remarried. But there's no mention of her second husband on the tombstone, just of Mozart. And so we know where his wife was buried, we know where his father was buried, but we do not know where Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was buried. Mozart wrote one of my favorite arias called the Queen of the Night aria. It's actually from the opera The Magic Flute, which combines comedy with kind of a serious, tragic story. And so the comic side of the story is you have these two quasi-bird people. So you have these two characters that have feathers all over them, and they are just cute and funny, and just they become a cute little couple, and he plays this little magic flute that charms the birds. And they have a cute little story of their own. And then on the other side, you have this evil Queen of the Night. And this evil Queen of the Night has kidnapped her own daughter to get revenge on her estranged husband. In this aria, the queen is demanding that her daughter kill her father, who is the evil queen's estranged husband. So there is definitely some family issues here, and there is this, this quasi-knight in shining armor who comes and saves the daughter who has been kidnapped. But that is the tragic side of the story, because none of that goes well. But the two little bird people, they are kind of the comic relief of the whole story. The reason I like this aria so much is it's just extremely difficult to sing. The notes in this aria are extremely high and just almost impossible to sing. And so, interestingly, the Queen of the Night character is not a huge character in the opera, but she has this huge aria, and you have to have one of the best singers and one of the highest sopranos in the whole opera company to be able to sing this aria. And so I think possibly Mozart had this great singer that he wanted to give this aria to, but she may not have been the best actress. And so he didn't give her a lot of stage time, but he gave her this fantastic aria. So an aria, this is going to be on the test, an aria is a song for solo voice with orchestral accompaniment. And an aria is somewhere in the middle of an opera where the action stops for a moment so that you can hear your favorite singer sing a solo, and then the action picks up again after the aria. There is no listening guide for this aria, but since this is one of my favorites, I couldn't resist having this be part of our studies and listening to it, so I hope you enjoy it. I am having you all listen to the Queen of the Night aria instead of listening to the opera that is in the textbook, which is Don Giovanni. So we won't be listening to Don Giovanni, but this will take the place of that. If you look in your textbook on page 230 to 232, you will see the listening guide for the piano concerto in A major by Mozart. So remember, a concerto is a composition for instrumental soloist and orchestra. And so by this time, some of the really famous instrumentalists are performing all over the countryside. They go from one orchestra to the next, and similar to what they do today. They get a lineup of orchestras that they're going to play with, and they go around and they play their concertos. And when your favorite artist comes to town, you want to go and hear the orchestra play the concerto with your favorite artist. And you'll see the listening guide. This is in your sonata form. Remember, you have your exposition, and that goes for there are 2 expositions. The first exposition lasts about 2 minutes, and the second exposition lasts into another 2 minutes into it. Then you have your development, where Mozart takes your themes from the first and second exposition and develops them and changes keys and just plays them a little bit. And then you have your recapitulation, which is the recap of what you've heard in the exposition. And this time, again, we don't change keys. In the exposition, you go from tonic to dominant. In the recapitulation, you stay in tonic. And then, again, you have this cadenza. This cadenza that you are hearing was probably written out, but Mozart, when he would have played it, would have probably just made it up when he was on the spot. But again, as we were saying in concertos, they're beginning to write some of these cadenzas out, so there's not as many options for the performer, although any performer is welcome to make up their own cadenza. But so that the orchestra will know when it's time to come in, after this long cadenza where everything is supposed to be made up, they will have this extended trill. And so that's the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, just going up and down really fast. And you'll hear that in the piece, so the orchestra knows it's about time to come in, the instrument's up. And then there's this little head nod from the artist to say to the conductor, I'm done. And then they all come in together. And so I hope you enjoy listening to this concerto for piano, the new instrument of the day. Remember, we talked about how the harpsichord has been replaced by the piano. So they're showing off these the new abilities of this new instrument, the grand piano, and the piano concerto number 23 in A major. The last piece that we will listen to by Mozart is his Dies Irae from the Requiem by Mozart. A Requiem Mass is actually a Mass for the dead. Our listening guide for this is on page 235. Many say that Mozart was writing his own Requiem, and in fact, this piece was sung at Mozart's funeral. So during this time, he was not feeling very well. He was depressed and saddened by his financial situation and feeling like he was not living up to the expectations that his father had of him. And he was just having a lot of difficulty, and he was feeling guilty as a father for not being able to pay the bills correctly. And so he was just really having a lot of trouble during this time. And these are the words from this Mass. Day of wrath, day of mourning, earth in smoldering ashes lying, so spake David and the Sibyl. How great the trembling shall be when the judge shall come, by whose sentence all shall be bound. Day of wrath, day of mourning, earth in smoldering ashes lying, so spake David and the Sibyl. How great the trembling shall be when the judge shall come, by whose sentence all shall be bound. How great the trembling shall be. Day of wrath, day of mourning, how great the trembling shall be. How great the trembling shall be, when the judge shall come, by whose sentence all shall be bound. By whose sentence all shall be bound. So you can tell that during this time he was feeling very judged by his father, he was feeling judged by his wife, he was feeling judged by his employers, and he was again just expressing this sad emotion and feeling of judgment. And this is what he put into this Mass that again was sung during his funeral. Click on the YouTube link to hear Dies Irae.
I hope you enjoyed your study on Mozart. We will be studying about Beethoven next time we get together. And then our third exam over the Baroque and the Classical era will follow our study on Beethoven and our student report on Beethoven. All right, thanks.